We're here today with Eileen Kladivko from the Purdue Agronomy Department. It's really good to meet with you. I've read a couple of your articles and I got kind of fired up when I started seeing them. And I think the first thing that we wanted to talk about was about earthworms. Tell us a little bit about how you got into your research and how you got interested in it before we start looking at some of the work, the actual work that you've done.
Okay, great. I actually got into earthworm work about 30 years ago. So when I first came to Purdue, I started doing a lot of work on conservation tillage, no-till, chisel plow, ridge till.
Right.
And one of the things that I was interested in, of course, was water flow through the soil.
Okay.
And nobody in the Midwest at that time, that was the early 80s, was doing any work on earthworms. And I noticed from literature from Europe and from New Zealand and Australia that, that earthworms were very important in no-till systems for keeping the soil, for building macropores and getting water flow into the soil. So I thought, we ought to look at that here in the Midwest.
Well, that sounds interesting. Now, before we start, you had mentioned, or you had in your article, talked about three general types of earthworms. Could you explain that to us so that we understand? It seems like there are many, many different species, but there are sort of trophic levels that they seem to occupy, or at least levels in the soil horizon.
Right. So there's three main behavioral groupings of earthworms, and the first one is generally not found in agricultural systems, and those are the litter dwellers, and they basically live in the litter layer, leaf litter in a forest, for example.
Yes.
But even a no-till system is too disturbed. Our agricultural systems are too disturbed, so we typically do not have that type of earthworm. The other two are present in agricultural fields, and one of them is the deep burrowing earthworm, which in the northern part of North America, there is only one species, and it's what we commonly call the night crawler. It's Lumbricus terrestris. And then there's the other types of worms are the shallow dwelling worms, which live essentially in the topsoil, so the top 10 inches or so of the soil. And I can tell you a lot more about their behaviors if you want.
Well, I'd like that. So the top 10 inches, really, that's kind of the plow layer, isn't it?
Yes.
And they might be the most vulnerable, if you will, to, especially in your growing season, to any kind of tillage. Is that correct?
Actually, it's the opposite. It's opposite of what you might think. So even though the shallow dwellers live in that topsoil, they actually are less sensitive to tillage than are the night crawlers. And the reason is that the night crawlers have a permanent burrow, and they basically have residues at the soil surface. And so their ecological niche is to have residues at the surface and to have a burrow that's more or less permanent. So every time you do a tillage operation, you break up the top of their burrow. And every time you bury residue, they no longer have their preferred ecological niche. So actually, they're more sensitive to tillage systems than are the shallow dwelling worms.
Well, I've just learned something new. Not that's pretty good. Well, and then essentially, when you're tilling for the night crawlers, then it's like a tornado, and you're coming and sort of taking the roof off their house.
Exactly. Right. So you pretty much break up the top 6-8 inches depending on what tillage system you're doing. So they would have to reform the top of that burrow, and of course, if there's no residue on the surface, they don't like that either. Okay. Well, then that leads to another question. Then these two different types of earthworms, the shallow burrowing and then the night crawlers, what do they normally, what do they live on? What do they eat? Right. So the night crawlers preferentially eat organic materials. So they like the residues at the surface. They pull them down into the mouth of their burrow, maybe an inch or two, where they soften up and they might actually start to be decomposed by fungi, and then the night crawlers will feed on the residue as well as the fungi that have been growing on the residue. The shallow dwelling worms eat both mineral soil and organic materials, so they have more of a mixture of a diet. The night crawlers eat some mineral soil too, but they're primarily feeding on the organic materials, and again, primarily those that are at the soil surface.
Okay, so the shallow dwellers are going to eat that mineral soil and the organics in that, and then sort of digest all of the microbes and all of the biota in that mineral soil, or in the soil itself.
Yes, they're
so they're eating organic materials in the mineral soil as well. So, for example,
Right.
there would still be some recognizable residues.
Okay.
It's not just the mineral soil.
Yes,
Okay,
yes,
so
yes.
they'd feed on old corn stalks or soybean residues or roots, as well as the mineral soil. And they
Got it.
actually get their nutrition from the residues, as
Yes.
well as from some of the microbes that are colonizing residues or are in the
Okay.
soil.
And what about humus? I guess humus is also part of that sort of organic matter component in the soil.
Yes, but humus usually refers to the organic materials that are pretty far along in the decomposition stage,
So
so
that-
they're not likely to get much nutrition out of
Got it.
humus because it's already been
It's
decomposed.
decomposed a lot and it's kind of stable.
Right, exactly.
Okay, well that's interesting. Now you said there were a few more things you wanted to tell us about the ones in the shallow area, the shallow dwellers.
Yes, so the shallow dwellers are active really two different times of the year. So they're active in the spring,
Okay.
okay, and then when the soil starts to get a little too hot and
Yes.
dry, so for Indiana a lot of times that's about mid-May,
Right.
they move down a little bit deeper, maybe 15 inches, maybe 18 inches, and they go into a resting stage, a summer resting stage. So they curl up in a little ball, and actually they look like they're tied themselves up in a knot,
yes.
and they secrete a mucus to try to keep from drying out, and then that's how they spend the summer. So during most of the summer, they're not in the plow layer anymore.
Okay, so that's
okay?
why you said earlier that
Yeah.
they're not affected. Yeah, and we saw a little bit of that estivation in Virginia and
Okay,
when
yes.
we were in State College. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So they estivate all summer,
Right.
And then in the fall, again, the month is going to depend on the weather. But when it gets cooler and it starts to rain again, it might be October, it might be November.
Right.
They become active again, and
Yes.
so they come shallow again, and they become active.
Right.
And then as it starts to get cold, then they move down, and then they go into a winter hibernation
Got it,
stage.
got it.
So really, they're active for a couple months in the spring and maybe a month or so in the fall, depending on the weather in any given year.
Got it. Okay. Well, you became interested in these things 30 years ago. Obviously, there's a significance. What is the significance of these creatures in our soils? What does it mean to the farmer, to the ecologist even,
Right.
to have these things in our soils?
Right. Well, so I'm going to use earthworms as a general thing.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
for both. There's a lot of beneficial effects of earthworms on soils, and again, I usually categorize them into three main types of categories. One is they make burrows, or they dig burrows.
Yes.
And so for the shallow dwelling worms, those can help increase the overall porosity of the topsoil primarily. For the deep burrowers, those deep burrows conduct water down into the soil. They also give a channel for roots to grow in. I should say, so they dig burrows, they mix organic materials,
Yes.
and they basically improve soil aggregation or soil tilth.
Okay.
And-
Right, and you had in one of your articles referred to the drillosphere. We hear a lot about the rhizosphere, but tell us a little bit about the drillosphere. Is that for both of these types of earthworms, or is that more for the deep burrowing ones?
It's more for the deep burrowing ones.
Okay.
The drillosphere is basically where you have the cast material.
Yes.
So the night crawlers, some of their casts, which is the excrement, some of that is up at the top in their middens, and some of that lines their channels. And
Yes.
so you have partially decomposed organic materials mixed with mineral soil that they've excreted,
Yes.
and it's got a higher nutrient availability than the surrounding soil. And also, earthworms are kind of slimy, so some of the mucus from the worm is also in that drillosphere. So it's a very highly active biological zone.
Zone, okay, yeah. So it's a little bit, in a sense, it has its parallel to the rhizosphere.
Yes.
In the same, probably a different population of microbes and whatever else
Right,
that would be there.
It would be a different population of microbes, but basically very, very highly active, high nutrient availability, So what we find is that roots, if they happen across one of those nightcrawler channels, then they're going to proliferate. Yeah,
Okay.
right. Because for a couple of reasons. Number one is it's an easy place to grow.
Yes.
Because it's already a preformed channel, and
Yes.
then another one is because there's higher nutrient availability because of that casting material and all the biological activity that's going on in that zone.
So they'll preferentially seek that zone out.
Yes.
It's the right temperature, it's the right humidity and everything
Right,
else.
right.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
yeah,
I like
it's-
that. So the night crawlers, the deep burrowers, okay, tell me, Lumbricus
terrestris.
Lumbricus terrestris. They have those deep channels, those are permanent, and those are the ones that are disturbed most by tillage. The shallow dwelling ones, now they're in the top 30 centimeters.
Yes.
Now, do they also sort of go, from what I understood, they're a lot on the actual surface of the soil, or is it, is that the zone that they're in?
They're more in the soil itself.
Okay.
So right on the surface would be more what I was talking about with the litter dwellers, although they're in the litter. But the shallow dwellers will be where, there will be on the surface between residues and the soil surface sometimes as they're feeding on some of those residues. But really they're more in the entire topsoil. And they're burrowing, randomly is not quite the right word, but they're burrowing and ingesting both the residues and the mineral soil as they go. And their casts are coming out the back end, and they don't leave permanent burrows. So they don't really have anything that's open for a prolonged length in general.
So they're sort of the nomads of the soil.
Correct. That's right.
They don't have a place to stay. Okay.
Yeah.
But they fill that important function. Tell us about how they would affect something like bulk density.
If you have a large number, the earthworms would generally tend to decrease the bulk density some.
Yes.
There's a limit to that because, as I said, the casts are coming out the back end,
Right.
and so as they burrow through the soil, they're making burrows, and there will be those holes in the soil. But they would, in general, increase the porosity and decrease the bulk density somewhat.
All of those things that really the farmer wants to have to supply minerals and nutrients to the plant.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, let's move on. You did a rather delightful a nickname, an earthworm safari.
Yes.
And you produced an article in '97, which I read this morning.
Okay.
And I was very interested in. And how about telling us a little bit about that study that you did?
Okay, sure. So I had done some research on Purdue research farms on earthworms, and basically had found, just what we had expected based on what others had found in Europe and Australia and New Zealand, that where we had no-till, we generally had higher populations than where we had conventional tillage, which was either moldboard plow or even chiseling. But I wanted to, the Purdue research farms I had worked on, there was 3 of them, but nonetheless I wanted to get out and see whether we would find the same thing on farmers' fields with no-till as practiced by farmers. So we went out and looked at 14 pairs of sites, and I had a person from NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, help me find comparable sites. So we basically went to a no-till field and a conventionally tilled field, or in most cases a chisel field, that was nearby, across the fence or across the road, or as close as we could. Same soil type,
series?
Same soil series, same general crop rotation, which was corn, soybean. I chose only corn, soybean, and I chose to do this in the spring after soybeans, because again, you might have some slight differences in population the year after corn versus the year after soybeans. So I just wanted to eliminate that kind of variable.
Variability.
Right.
Yeah, I noticed that you were doing it only after the soybeans. Okay, very good, yeah.
And part of the reason after soybeans was it was a little easier to also look for the nightcrawler middens after soybeans, because there's generally less residue. So
on the ground.
I could have chosen either, but I chose that.
Okay.
And so basically what we did was during April, we went out and counted populations. So we counted the redworm populations by excavating a known area of soil, and and sorting through the soil by hand and counting the worms. And then for the night crawlers, all I did at that point was observe whether there were appreciable middens or not. We were early enough in our work at that point that I wasn't actually counting middens.
Okay.
In the meantime, I've done some of that where we count how many middens per square meter are there. But in that study, I basically, which is very painstakingly.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah.
But we basically I just said, are there appreciable middens here or not?
Got it.
And that's what we did. So, but we had a crew of people because again, it takes quite a bit of effort to dig a known area of soil, and we were going down 10 inches deep and then sorting through all that soil by hand and counting the worms.
Been there, done that.
Yeah. So it was very interesting, and what we ended up finding was that the majority of the pairs of sites had more more worms, earthworms in general in no-till than in conventional.
Right.
We had a few sites where there wasn't really much difference, but those tended to be sites where there were very few worms. Period.
And those were more sandy sites, right? So the higher the sand content, I believe, the lower your earthworm, or at least it was inversely correlated to the amount of sand and then positively correlated to the amount of clay, percentage of clay.
I think that's right, although I must say I have not looked at my own
okay.
paper recently. But in general, they
Yes.
don't like sand as well because it's just the particles are too big. So there's a couple reasons. One is they can't necessarily ingest them,
Okay.
and the other one is just it's rough on their skin.
Right, and they've got those soft skins, and
Yes.
so that'll cause
Right.
scratching and what
Right,
have you.
exactly.
Got it. Okay.
Exactly, yeah. Most of our soils were actually silt loam, so I do need to just make sure that people understand that this was not soils that ranged greatly in
Yes.
texture.
Got it.
I'm in central Indiana, central Illinois. The heaviest texture that we had was a silty clay loam, so the clay was never above 35%.
Got it, yes.
And that would be a big difference if you're talking about clay contents of 50, 60, 70%.
Well, that's almost subsoil then, I
Well,
guess. Yeah.
right. So I think there that essentially the sand and the clay were almost inversely proportional to each other because
Yes.
all of these had pretty high silt content.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. It's kind of interesting. We talked about this. I think it was at Ohio State,
Okay.
and then I saw you mentioned it as well. This whole idea that when farmers were tilling conventionally, often they found that stalks were a problem in their fields.
Right.
Whereas the no-till farmers trying to keep that residue on the ground, the soil biology was bringing it down, and
Right.
I guess part of the night crawlers were taking them down into
Yes.
into their middens.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about what you found in that part of your study.
Right. Actually, some of the fields, there was some concern that the night crawlers were eating so much of the residue that they might actually fall out of conservation compliance because the residue cover might not meet the standard that was necessary for calling it a conservation system. So yeah, I would say where there's a good amount of night crawler activity, that excess residue is not an issue. That we'd like, in fact, sometimes I think we need to feed them even more, and that kind of leads into cover crops, which is something that I'm working a lot more on now as well. But basically, the night crawlers do a tremendous job in moving residues around.
Right, and basically bringing it and capturing it in the soil as well.
Yes, right.
Well, why don't we segue into cover cropping, because
Okay.
I figured that was something. So we talk about feeding the soil and then the soil feeding the plants. Tell us the role of earthworms or cover crops in feeding earthworms.
Okay, so I think a lot of our limitations for earthworm populations, at least in the Midwest, there's two things. One is residue cover or lack thereof, and that's because of the mulching effect. And then the other one is food. And you might think that 200 bushel corn would be plenty of food for the earthworms, but it's actually somewhat limited. And so cover crops can add to that. And of course, cover crops would have several attributes that the stover of the corn plants would not. and that is that usually our cover crops stay vegetative, which means they're higher quality. If you look at the residues, they're higher nitrogen content.
Okay.
We have live roots, and we have materials being put into the soil at a time of year that we typically don't have any food being added. So when you think about
the fallow period, typically it was the fallow period.
Exactly, yeah. And if you think about when I said the earthworms in general were the most active, they're the most active in November, or that fall period when we don't have anything normally growing,
Yes.
and during late March and April and early May when we might not have anything growing. So if we can fill some of that fallow period with cover crops, we're providing them with more food. We're also potentially providing them with more cover, although if you're doing no-till, you already have pretty good cover, but after soybeans, that it would really add to your cover.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you something. Would earthworms be considered an indicator organism, or much more than just an indicator organism in the soil?
It's a little tricky as an indicator.
Okay.
I usually say that if you have a lot of earthworms, that probably indicates high soil quality or soil health. If you don't have a lot of earthworms, it doesn't necessarily indicate poor quality, because
Yes.
there are different reasons why you might not have earthworms there. And there are other organisms that are important in the soil too. So just by itself, the lack of earthworms is not necessarily indicating bad soil quality.
Got it.
But if you have a lot of them, it's almost certainly indicating good quality.
Okay, got it.
I guess just any time that you can provide more food for the earthworms, you're generally going to build populations. And so cover crops would be one way to do that. Animal manures can be, another way to do that.
So they're also looking for a little bit of nitrogen in their diet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Pretty much like the microbes, yeah.
Right, right.
Okay.
And where we have rotations with things like alfalfa, I mean, some of the highest populations we ever found were fields that, had just come out of alfalfa and were growing corn in tremendous populations. So again, that's both because it was a permanent cover for a few years, plus it's a legume, so it has a good carbon-nitrogen ratio, so it's a really good food source for them.
You mentioned a number of Australian and New Zealand studies where they had found an increase in soil fertility once they had imported some of these populations in their fields. Have you found, in general, an increase in fertility here? Well, I think you've kind of covered that, haven't you?
Well, it depends on where you start from. So I would say most of the fields that I've looked at, the higher worm population is not necessarily related to fertility of the soil, the way we typically measure fertility, right? Which is to take bulk soil samples.
Right.
But we're starting out with pretty good soil. So where you really can clearly see those fertility benefits is if you're starting out with pretty poor soil, and so there's a big, where you have the earthworm activity, it can really make a difference. So, some places when people are reclaiming strip mine soil or things like that, they've really seen a difference, or you're starting out with a pretty poor soil. One of the things that's difficult to quantify is, I said that the cast material is higher in nutrient availability, but that's a burrow, and that's the drillosphere, and it's that small amount along a burrow. Well, how many burrows do you have? How many roots are growing in those burrows? How do you sample that? And how do you scale that up to what impact it has on a field scale basis? So I haven't followed that path, but that's something where I think we need a lot more work on what kind of an impact that has on a field scale basis, and how important that might be, especially if we're talking about reduced tillage systems. I think that's no-till in particular. I think that could be quite significant, but we don't really have a lot of work to try to say exactly how much that adds up to on a field scale basis.
Okay. I want to cover a couple more subjects. Being a soil physicist, how does tillage affect these organisms in the soil?
Generally, tillage reduces the populations of many organisms in the soil, particularly the macro and mesofauna. So things like earthworms and beetles and springtails and mites and things like that. So kind of the medium to large size organisms.
Yes.
It decreases their population for a couple reasons. Number one is the mulch, or the lack of mulch, means that the soil is not buffered. So temperature and moisture content changes very rapidly.
Okay, so no more habitat.
No more no more habitat, and a habitat that's much harsher.
Okay.
Okay, right. And then the second thing is that some of those organisms need the residue at the surface as their food source. So some of the beetles, for example, don't burrow, right. And they're there kind of in between the residue and the soil, and if you don't have residue on the surface, they're not there.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
So tillage can also physically destroy some of the organisms, but that's really a pretty small part of the reason for lower populations. It's mostly the lack of a mulch cover and the lack of the food source at the surface, and just the disturbance in general.